Before 1970, a boy could name a revolver from across a hardware store counter the way he named baseball players. These were the guns in his father's nightstand, the sheriff's holster, the Sears catalog dog-eared under the bed. Number 3 rode on nearly every American lawman's hip for 50 years, and number 1 built the myth of the West itself. But most have vanished now. Number 12 once sold for $2. Let's count down the 15 revolvers every American man knew on sight. Number 15, the Iver Johnson Safety Automatic. For half a century, this was the gun a working man could actually afford, sold for around $5 off a hardware store shelf or straight out of a mail-order catalog with no questions asked. It was a top break design, the kind you snapped open at the breech to load, chambered in modest 32 and 38, and it lived in more American nightstands than any expensive Colt ever would. What every man remembered was the advertisement. Iver Johnson ran a campaign showing a baby playing with the loaded revolver above the slogan, "Hammer the Hammer," proof that its internal safety would not let the gun fire unless the trigger was deliberately pulled. That image was burned into the national memory, printed in magazines from coast to coast. The gun was so common that when President McKinley was assassinated in 1901, the weapon in the killer's hand was a cheap Iver Johnson, a fact that only cemented how ordinary and everywhere these revolvers had become. For the price of a good meal out, a man in Ohio or Georgia could own a reliable break-top pistol that fit a coat pocket and asked nothing of him. It was the revolver of clerks, farmers, and shopkeepers, the honest everyman's insurance. Yet as American gun tastes turned toward heavier steel and swing-out cylinders, the little break-top faded. By the 1960s, the Iver Johnson was a relic gathering dust in dresser drawers, remembered fondly, if at all, only by the men who once carried one to work. Number 14, the Harrington and Richardson Model 999 Sportsman. Out of Worcester, Massachusetts, came the revolver that taught a generation of American boys to shoot straight. The Model 999 was a top break target gun that swallowed 9 rounds of .22 long rifle, and it broke open at the hinge with a satisfying mechanical clack that any farm kid would recognize blindfolded. It cost far less than the fine Smith & Wesson target revolvers, which meant it was the plinker of the common family, the gun bought to knock tin cans off a fence rail on a Sunday afternoon. Fathers taught sons on the 999. Its long barrel and adjustable sights made it accurate enough to feel serious, yet it was cheap enough that nobody worried about a scratch on the bluing. The automatic ejector kicked all 9 empties clear at once when you cracked it open, a small piece of theater that delighted children and made reloading fast. In rural America, the H&R was as much a part of growing up as a first pocket knife or a bicycle. It rode in the truck, hung in the barn, and came out for squirrels and target practice alike. But H&R built its reputation on affordability, not prestige, and as the company struggled through the changing decades, its guns lost their grip on the popular imagination. The Sportsman survived into later years in name, but the classic top break 9-shooter, the one every rural man of a certain age could picture in an instant, quietly disappeared from the shelves and the memory of a nation that had moved on. Number 13, the Smith & Wesson 38 Safety Hammerless, known to everyone who carried one as the lemon squeezer. Introduced in the late 1880s and made until the eve of the Second World War, this top break revolver had no visible hammer to snag on a pocket lining and a spring-loaded lever running down the back of the grip that had to be squeezed before the gun would fire. That grip safety earned it the nickname because closing your hand around it felt like squeezing fruit. For decades, it was the discreet gentleman's pistol, the one a banker slipped into a vest pocket or a lady tucked into a handbag, safe against accidental discharge yet ready in an instant. Its rounded, snag-free profile was instantly familiar, appearing in general stores and pawn shop windows in every American town. The double-action mechanism meant a simple long pull of the trigger fired each shot, no cocking required, which made it forgiving for the untrained. A man did not need to be a marksman to feel protected with a lemon squeezer in his coat. It represented a particular kind of turn-of-the-century respectability, self-defense without spectacle. But the top break design had a ceiling. It could never handle the more powerful cartridges that Americans came to demand, and the swing-out cylinder revolvers made it look old-fashioned almost overnight. By the post-war years, the lemon squeezer was a curiosity. Its grip safety, a strange feature younger shooters had never seen. Its gentle mechanical squeeze forgotten by a country that had grown to prefer heavier iron and a harder bark. Number 12, the Hopkins Allen. Out of Norwich, Connecticut, poured hundreds of thousands of these small, plain revolvers, and they were the guns that armed Americans who had almost nothing. The cheapest examples sold for $2, sometimes less, the kind of price that put a firearm in the hand of a laborer, a homesteader, or a drifter with a few coins to spare. Sold under dozens of names through hardware stores and the great mail-order catalogs, the Hopkins Allen was the definition of a common gun, the workhorse of ordinary people who could never dream of a fine Colt. The Better XL line was a solid, honest, double-action revolver, while the bottom of the range was so inexpensive that these guns earned a grim national nickname as suicide specials, a testament to just how little they cost. For every celebrated pistol that rode into legend on a cowboy's hip, 100 anonymous Hopkins Allen revolvers rode in coat pockets and wagon boxes across a hard country, doing quiet, unglamorous work. They protected saloon owners and settled arguments and were traded, pawned, and passed along until they wore out. The company thrived for decades on selling to the many rather than the few. But cheapness was its whole identity, and cheapness could not survive forever. Financial trouble dogged the firm, and around the time of the First World War, it was absorbed and shut down. The name vanished from the catalogs. Today, the Hopkins Allen is a footnote, yet for millions of Americans, it was the first and only gun they ever owned, recognized on sight because it was simply everywhere. Number 11, the Colt New Service. When an American needed a big, serious revolver, this was the fist of iron he reached for. Introduced in 1898 and built until the Second World War, the New Service was a massive, heavy-frame six-shooter, chambered in thunderous cartridges like the .45 Colt and the .38 Special, a gun that filled a large man's palm and inspired confidence by sheer weight alone. The United States military adopted a version, and the New Service rode in the flap holsters of soldiers in the Philippines and the trenches of France. But it was the men of law and order who made it famous. Texas Rangers carried it, border lawmen carried it, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police carried it for generations, so that its silhouette became linked with the red-coated riders of the northern frontier. It was the revolver you wanted when the situation was truly dire, a swing-out cylinder gun powerful enough to stop a horse or a determined man. Every American who read the pulp magazines or watched the newsreels knew that heavy Colt profile, the gun of manhunts and last stands. It projected authority the way a courthouse projects the law, yet its very size worked against it as the century wore on. Departments wanted lighter, faster guns that a man could carry all day without fatigue, and newer designs offered nearly the same power in a friendlier package. Production ended during the war and never resumed. The mighty New Service, the big Colt that once meant business across 3 countries, slipped out of holsters and out of memory. Number 10, the Model 1917, made in 2 forms by both Colt and Smith & Wesson. This is the revolver born of desperation, and every veteran of the Great War knew it on sight. When America entered the fight in 1917, there were nowhere near enough of the new semi-automatic pistols to arm the troops, so the government turned to the 2 great revolver houses and asked them to chamber their large frame guns for the .45 automatic cartridge. The clever solution was the half-moon clip, a small stamped steel piece that held the rimless pistol rounds together so they could be loaded into a revolver's cylinder and ejected cleanly. Suddenly, a doughboy could carry a rugged, reliable 6-shooter that fired the same ammunition as the automatics. Hundreds of thousands went to France, and they served in the mud in the trenches when the newfangled pistols jammed or ran short. Men trusted the 1917 because a revolver simply worked, turn after turn, in filth that would choke a self-loader. After the war, countless surplus 1917s came home and found second lives on farms and ranches, big, tough, cheap, and dependable, and the half-moon clip became a familiar oddity in a shooter's kit. For decades, the old military .45 was a staple of the American gun world, recognized instantly by anyone who had worn the uniform. But surplus dries up, cartridges change, and the wartime revolver became a collector's piece, its heroism in 2 world wars fading into the fine print of history. Number 9. The Colt Official Police. For over 40 years, this was the standard by which an American police revolver was measured. Introduced in 1927 and produced until the end of the 1960s, the Official Police was a medium-large, 6-shooter and .38 special. And it did exactly what its name promised, arming departments in cities and small towns across the entire nation. If you pictured a beat cop of the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, the gun on his hip was very likely this Colt, its bluing, worn silver along the edges from years riding in a leather holster. It was accurate, durable, and built to survive a career of daily carry and occasional abuse. Millions rolled out of the Hartford factory, and they went not only to police but to prison guards, railway agents, and private security men, becoming the quiet companion of anyone whose job required a firearm. The Official Police was never flashy. It made no claim to be a target gun or a Magnum, just an honest working revolver that a man could stake his life on, and generations of officers did exactly that. Its solid, no-nonsense lines were as much a part of the American streetscape as the patrol car and the call box. But Colt's great rival at Smith & Wesson was capturing the police market with lighter, smoother designs, and the tide slowly turned. When production finally ended, an era ended with it. The gun that had defined American law enforcement for 2 generations was retired, and the young officers who followed would never know the weight of an official police. Number 8. The Smith & Wesson Victory Model. When the world went to war again, this was the revolver that guarded the home front and armed the men who kept the ships and planes moving. A wartime version of Smith & Wesson's classic service revolver, the Victory Model wore a dull gray Parkerized finish instead of bright bluing, plain wood grips, and a serial number that began with the letter VI, for victory, a mark that told every American exactly what it was. Hundreds of thousands were built. Some went to Britain and the Commonwealth, chambered for their cartridge, while others in .38 Special stayed home to arm defense plant guards, merchant marine sailors, aircraft factory watchmen, and military police. It was the pistol on the belt of the man protecting the shipyard gate, the guard walking the perimeter of an aircraft plant through the blackout. Practical, plain, and produced by the flood, the Victory Model became the workaday sidearm of a nation mobilized for total war, and after 1945, a great river of them poured into the surplus market. For decades afterward, a young man could buy a Victory Model cheaply, a piece of the war effort he could hold in his hand, and it became a familiar first revolver for countless Americans. That gray finish and the telltale V prefix were recognized everywhere. But surplus guns are finite, and as the stock dried up and collectors quietly gathered the survivors, the humble Victory Model retreated from the pawn shop counter into the display case and the fading recollection of the wartime generation. Number 7, the Colt Cobra. Colt took its beloved snub-nosed detective's revolver and gave it an aluminum frame, and the result was a lightweight little 6-shooter that a man could carry all day and forget was even there. Made from 1950 into the early 1980s, the Cobra was chambered in .38 Special, wore a 2-inch barrel, and weighed noticeably less than its all-steel cousin, which made it the darling of plainclothes detectives, off-duty officers, and ordinary citizens who wanted serious protection in a coat pocket. It was the revolver of the mid-century American who valued discretion, small enough to vanish under a suit jacket, yet chambered for a cartridge that commanded respect. But the Cobra earned its permanent place in the national memory in a single, terrible instant. In 1963, in the basement of a Dallas police station, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped forward and shot Lee Harvey Oswald with a Colt Cobra, and the moment was captured on live television in front of a stunned nation. That snub-nosed Colt became one of the most photographed handguns in American history, its lightweight aluminum frame forever tied to a day the country could not forget. For years afterward, the Cobra remained a favorite carry gun, its name and profile familiar to anyone who followed the news or the crime dramas. Yet the tide of American self-defense eventually turned toward compact semi-automatics, and Colt's snubbies slowly left the market. The lightweight little revolver that once rode in 1,000 coat pockets and appeared in one of the century's most infamous images quietly slipped from the everyday and into the archive. Number 6. The Ruger Blackhawk. In the mid-1950s, a clever New England manufacturer named Bill Ruger bet that Americans still loved the single-action revolver of the frontier, and he was gloriously right. The Blackhawk arrived in 1955 as a modern six-shooter built in the old Western style, the kind you cocked by thumbing back the hammer for each shot, but made with contemporary steel, coil springs, and adjustable sights. He chambered it first for the potent new .357 Magnum, and soon after for the earth-shaking .44 Magnum, and he sold it at a price the working man could actually reach. The timing was perfect. Television westerns had every American boy and grown man dreaming of the frontier, and here was an affordable, rugged, honestly powerful single action he could take to the hills. The Blackhawk became the gun of hunters, ranchers, and weekend shooters across the West and beyond. Its flat-topped frame and plow handle grip instantly recognizable as a fresh take on an American legend. It brought the cowboy revolver roaring back to life for a new century and proved that a small company could challenge the giants. For decades, it was everywhere the outdoors were, riding in saddlebags and truck consoles from Montana to Texas. While Ruger still builds fine single actions today, the original flat-top Blackhawk of that first exuberant run, the gun that reignited America's love affair with the Frontier six-gun, has become a prized and half-forgotten classic, remembered clearly only by the men who carried one up a mountain in their youth. Number 5. The Smith & Wesson Model 27, the original .357 Magnum. In 1935, Smith & Wesson unleashed the most powerful production revolver in the world, and it was a masterpiece. Built on the company's largest frame and hand-finished to a mere polish, this was the gun that introduced the mighty .357 Magnum cartridge, a round that could punch through the engine block of a getaway car and outshoot anything a criminal could carry. Each early example was a registered Magnum, sold with a certificate and tuned to order, the finest revolver American money could buy. It was the choice of men who took their shooting seriously and could afford the best, from famous lawmen to General George Patton, who carried an ivory-gripped Magnum as a personal sidearm. The FBI embraced it during the gangster wars, wanting firepower to match the outlaws. For the American who understood guns, the big Smith & Wesson Magnum was the summit, a revolver of such quality and power that owning one marked a man as a true connoisseur. Its deep royal blue finish caught the light like black glass, and its checkered top strap was a small signature of craftsmanship. Through the decades, it held its place as the flagship of the line, the standard against which every other revolver was judged. But hand finishing is expensive. Tastes shifted toward lighter and cheaper guns, and the golden age quality of that first Magnum became too costly to sustain. The gun that once represented the absolute pinnacle of the revolver maker's art slipped from common knowledge, treasured now by collectors who understand what was lost. Number 4. The Colt Detective Special. In 1927, Colt did something that changed American self-defense forever. It took a full 6-shot 38 special cylinder and mated it to a stubby 2-inch barrel, creating the original snub-nosed detective's revolver and giving the concealed carry gun its definitive shape. The Detective Special was compact enough to disappear under a suit coat or into a coat pocket, yet it carried 6 rounds of a serious cartridge, a combination that plainclothes officers had been waiting for. It became the signature gun of the American detective. The piece flashed under a trench coat in 1,000 crime films, the hidden equalizer in the shoulder holster of every hard-boiled investigator in the popular imagination. When Americans pictured a private eye or a big city detective, the gun in his hand was this short-barreled Colt. It armed real detectives and off-duty cops for generations, riding in ankle holsters and glove boxes and desk drawers, always close, always ready. Its blunt, purposeful silhouette became shorthand for danger and authority in the movies and on television, and its very name entered the language as a description of a whole class of gun. For half a century, the Detective Special was the concealed revolver, recognized instantly by anyone who had ever watched a cop show or read a detective novel. But the rise of the flat, high-capacity semi-automatic pistol slowly stole its niche, and Colt's snub nose left the catalog. The little six-shooter that invented the pocket revolver and defined the look of the American detective faded into nostalgia. Number 3. The Smith & Wesson Military and Police, later known as the Model 10. If one revolver deserves to be called the gun that armed America, this is it. First offered at the very end of the 19th century and produced by the millions, more than 6 million by most reckonings, the Military and Police in .38 Special became the single most popular revolver of the entire 20th century and the standard sidearm of American law enforcement for generation after generation. For roughly 70 years, if a police officer in the United States drew a revolver, the odds were overwhelming that it was this Smith & Wesson. It rode on the hips of city cops and county sheriffs, state troopers, and prison guards, from the smallest rural township to the largest metropolis. Its swing-out cylinder, smooth double-action trigger, and utter reliability made it the gold standard, the gun every other maker measured itself against. It was so ubiquitous that its 4-inch blued profile became the very definition of the word revolver in the American mind, the shape a child would draw if asked to draw a pistol. Servicemen carried it, security men carried it, and countless households kept one for protection. It was accurate, affordable, and nearly indestructible. A design so right that it barely needed changing across 7 decades. Every American man alive before 1970 knew this gun on sight because it was simply the revolver, the default, the one on the news, and in the holster, and in the drawer. Yet even the great Model 10 could not hold back the semi-automatic age, and the revolver that once ruled American policing gradually gave way, its long reign remembered now mostly by those who wore a badge. Number 2, the Colt Python. When Colt wanted to build the finest double-action revolver the world had ever seen, it built the Python, and for many Americans it remains the most beautiful handgun ever made. Introduced in 1955 as a premium .357 Magnum, the Python wore a distinctive ventilated rib along the top of its barrel, a full underlug that gave it a muscular balance, and a deep royal blue finish so lustrous that men called it a mirror you could shoot. Every Python was hand-fitted and hand-tuned by Colt's most skilled workers, its action so smooth that shooters described the trigger as rolling like glass on glass. It cost far more than an ordinary revolver, and it was worth it. A target-grade instrument that also delivered Magnum power, earning the nickname the Rolls-Royce of revolvers. Serious shooters, discerning collectors, and more than a few lawmen coveted the Python as the ultimate expression of the revolver maker's craft, a status symbol as much as a firearm. Its unmistakable ribbed barrel and gleaming finish made it recognizable at a glance and desirable beyond reason. Owning one meant you had reached the top. It appeared in the hands of screen heroes and became the aspirational gun, the one a working man saved for and dreamed about. But hand craftsmanship on that scale grew ruinously expensive, and Colt eventually could not justify the labor. The original Python left production, and its value soared as everyone realized what had vanished. The most gorgeous revolver America ever produced became a legend, spoken of in reverent tones by men who once pressed their noses to a gun shop glass just to look at one. Number 1, the Colt Single Action Army, the Peacemaker, the gun that won the West. No revolver is more deeply woven into the American soul than this one. Introduced in 1873 and chambered most famously in the Big 45 Colt, the Single Action Army was the sidearm of the cavalry, the cowboy, the lawman, and the outlaw, the six-shooter that rode across the frontier in every direction and settled a continent. You thumbed the hammer back for each shot, and the loading gate, the ejector rod, and the plow handle grip became the universal image of what a pistol was. It armed the men who tamed the cattle towns and the marshals who kept an uneasy peace, and it earned its enduring nickname as the Peacemaker on the strength of its reputation alone. But its real immortality came later, from the movie screen and the television set. As westerns flooded American theaters and living rooms through the middle of the century, every hero and villain wore a single action army on his hip, and an entire nation of boys grew up knowing that silhouette better than they knew the flag. Colt had actually stopped making it around the Second World War, judging it obsolete, only to be overwhelmed by demand when the television Western craze made every man and child want the gun of the cowboys, forcing the company to bring it roaring back in the mid-1950s. It was the first gun most American men could name and the last they would ever forget, the very definition of the word revolver, the shape of the frontier itself. Recognized on sight by every man, woman, and child in the country, the Peacemaker was not just a gun. It was America's idea of itself, cast in steel and walnut. From the $2 Hopkins and Allen to the frontier legend of the Peacemaker, these 15 revolvers were once as familiar to American men as a favorite ballpark or a father's handshake. They rode in nightstands, on lawmen's hips, and across 1,000 movie screens until the semi-automatic age and the closing of the old gun shops swept them quietly aside. Which one did your grandfather carry? Drop it in the comments, and if you remember these guns, you know exactly what we lost.